In the dimly lit streets of downtown Chicago, Ray Wilson navigated his taxi through the endless night shifts, scraping together every dollar he could to support his daughter's dream of medical school. For 10 years, his beaten-down yellow cab had been his lifeline, but on that stormy Thursday evening, a disabled veteran's struggle in the rain would force Ray to risk everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As he drove home that night, his taxi license revoked and his future uncertain, he had no idea that 3 powerful figures had witnessed his sacrifice, a moment that would transform his world forever. Ray lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment with his 16-year-old daughter, Anna. Their walls were adorned with her academic achievements and medical school brochures, dreams that seemed increasingly out of reach with each passing month. Every evening at 6, Ray would cook dinner before his night shift, making sure Anna had everything she needed for her studies. Their life wasn't easy, but their bond was unbreakable. Anna's mother had passed away when she was just 7, leaving Ray to raise their brilliant daughter alone. Since then, every decision, every extra shift, every sacrifice had been for Anna's future. The taxi industry had changed dramatically over the years, with ride-sharing services taking over the streets. But Ray held on to his medallion, paying the monthly installments that felt like a noose around his neck. His taxi company, Metro Express, was one of the few traditional services still operating, though their strict policies made every shift feel like walking on eggshells. The competition was fierce, and the company's survival depended on maintaining a perfect service record. Ray understood this, having watched countless colleagues lose their positions to cheaper alternatives and automated services. That Thursday started like any other. Ray had already completed 12 hours of his 16-hour shift, fighting through the heavy rain that pounded his windshield. The streets were eerily empty, with most people seeking shelter from the storm. His dispatcher, George Cooper, had been particularly demanding that evening, insisting that drivers maintain their quotas despite the weather. The pressure was mounting, as several drivers had already called in sick, leaving the remaining few to pick up the slack. Ray's muscles ached from the long hours, but he couldn't afford to go home early, not with Anna's college applications due next month. Around midnight, Ray pulled into the Veterans Hospital pickup zone, hoping for a quick fare before his break. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it difficult to see through the windshield. Through the downpour, he noticed a figure struggling with a wheelchair at the hospital entrance. The man was trying to navigate down the ramp while holding an umbrella, but the wind kept turning it inside out. The scene brought back memories of helping his late wife during her final months, when a simple trip to the hospital had become a monumental challenge. Company policy was clear. Drivers must remain in their vehicles at all times. 3 warnings in Ray's file meant one more violation would cost him his license. Just yesterday, George had reminded everyone during the morning briefing, "Your car is your station. Leave it, and you're done." The words echoed in Ray's mind as he watched the veteran struggle. The company's zero-tolerance policy had already claimed several drivers' jobs this month alone, each termination serving as a stark reminder of their precarious position in an evolving industry. Lightning illuminated the scene, and Ray caught a glimpse of military medals pinned to the man's jacket. The veteran's wheelchair kept sliding backward on the wet ramp, and his umbrella finally gave up, flying away in the wind. Other taxis drove past, their drivers pretending not to notice. Ray's hand hovered over his door handle as he remembered Anna's words from that morning. "Dad, sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks." She had said this while showing him her latest scholarship essay about moral courage in everyday life. Without another thought, Ray grabbed his raincoat and stepped out into the storm. The veteran looked up, surprise evident on his weather-beaten face. "Sir, please let me help you," Ray called out, already soaked to the bone. As he approached, he could see the man was older, probably in his 60s, with a prosthetic leg visible beneath his pants. The rain had plastered the veteran's silver hair to his forehead, and his military uniform bore the marks of distinguished service. "I'm Ray," he said, positioning himself behind the wheelchair. "Let's get you out of this rain." The veteran's hands were trembling, whether from cold or emotion. Ray couldn't tell. "Thomas Parker," the man responded softly, "but everyone calls me Tom. I didn't think anyone would stop." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. As Ray carefully guided the wheelchair down the ramp, his radio crackled to life. George's voice cut through the sound of rain. "Unit 247, what's your status? Your GPS shows you're out of vehicle." Ray's heart sank, but he continued helping Tom. "Almost there, sir," he assured the veteran, ignoring the radio's increasingly angry demands. The dispatcher's warnings grew more urgent with each passing moment. By the time they reached the taxi, both men were drenched. Ray helped Tom into the back seat, carefully folding the wheelchair and placing it in the trunk. As he settled back into the driver's seat, his radio buzzed again. George's voice was cold. "Unit 247, report to the office immediately after this fare. Your license status is now under review." Tom's voice came from the back seat, filled with concern. "Son, are you in trouble?" Ray met his eyes in the rearview mirror, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about, sir. Where can I take you tonight?" Tom gave an address across town, his eyes studying Ray's face with an intensity that seemed to look straight through him. The rain continued to pour outside, but in that moment, something unspoken passed between the two men, a recognition of sacrifice that transcended their brief encounter. The journey across town was mostly silent, broken only by the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers fighting against the relentless rain. Ray navigated carefully through the flooded streets, occasionally glancing at Tom in his rearview mirror. The veteran sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, but his eyes never left Ray's reflection. There was something in that steady gaze that made Ray both uncomfortable and curious. The medallion hanging from his mirror swayed gently with each turn, a constant reminder of the investment he might lose tonight. The taxi's radio remained silent now, but Ray could almost feel George's anger building back at the dispatch office. After 10 years of service, he knew the protocol well. Violation of company policy meant immediate suspension pending review. In the current economy, with ride-sharing services dominating the market, such suspensions usually ended in permanent termination. The thought made his stomach churn. Metro Express had already laid off a quarter of its workforce this year, each dismissal serving as a grim reminder of the industry's decline. Ray's mind wandered to Anna, probably still awake studying for her advanced placement exams. She had inherited her mother's determination and intelligence, maintaining perfect grades while working part-time at the local library. Her dream of becoming a doctor had been born during her mother's illness, watching the medical staff work tirelessly to give them a few more precious months together. Now that dream hung by the thread of Ray's taxi license. The stack of college brochures on their kitchen table seemed to mock him. Harvard, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, each representing a future that might slip away with his job. The streets grew narrower as they entered the older part of town, where Victorian houses stood like ancient sentinels in the rain. The neighborhood was clearly affluent, with manicured lawns and expensive cars parked in circular driveways. Tom directed them to a stately brick building with a small, well-maintained garden, visible even in the darkness. "The Thompson Veterans Center," Tom explained, noticing Ray's curious expression. "They provide temporary housing for vets transitioning back to civilian life. Been here 3 months myself." The building's facade spoke of old money and influence, its architecture more suggestive of a private club than a veterans facility. As Ray pulled up to the entrance, he noticed 3 black SUVs parked nearby, their windows tinted against the night. A security camera above the door turned slightly, following their movement. The building seemed too sophisticated for a typical veterans center, with its state-of-the-art security system and professionally landscaped grounds. Armed guards stood discreetly in the shadows, their presence barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Ray was too preoccupied with his own troubles to dwell on these peculiarities, But something about the scene nagged at the back of his mind. Before Ray could exit to help with the wheelchair, Tom raised his hand. "Wait, son, I need to know something." His voice had changed, carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. The rain drummed against the roof as Tom studied Ray's face. "Why did you help me? You knew you'd get in trouble. I heard your dispatcher. Your job was on the line." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken significance. Ray's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he considered the question. The rain drummed steadily on the roof as he thought about Anna, about his late wife, about all the times he'd needed help himself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His shift would normally be ending now, heading home to make breakfast for Anna before she left for school. "The rules exist for a reason, Wilson," George continued, his voice rising. "We're not a charity. We're not a medical transport service. We're not here to play hero to every person who needs help. We're a business, and businesses have protocols." He slapped the file down on his desk for emphasis. "Do you know how many drivers we've lost to rideshare companies? How thin our margins are? One lawsuit from an injured passenger during unauthorized assistance could sink this entire company." Ray's hand unconsciously moved to his pocket, feeling the weight of Tom's business card. He hadn't had a chance to look at it yet, but somehow its presence gave him strength. "Mr. Cooper," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I understand the rules. I've followed them for 10 years. But sometimes there are moments when being human has to come before being an employee." The words seemed to echo in the quiet office. A few of the dispatchers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. George's face darkened. "Being human doesn't pay the bills, Wilson. Being human doesn't keep this company afloat. Being human doesn't protect us from liability." He reached for a second form, this one bearing the company letterhead. "Your suspension is effective immediately. Given your previous record, we'll review your case in 2 weeks. Until then, turn in your medallion and clear out your locker." Ray's fingers closed around the medallion hanging from his rearview mirror, the license that had cost him his life savings, the piece of metal that represented his ability to provide for Anna. The monthly payments would still be due, suspension or not. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Her excitement over college applications, her determination to become a doctor, her unwavering faith in him. "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "I believe we need to discuss this situation further." The office door had opened silently, admitting 3 figures who seemed to fill the room with their presence. Ray recognized them from the Veterans Center, the woman in military dress and the 2 men in expensive suits. The woman stepped forward, her bearing commanding immediate attention. "Colonel Lisa Kennedy." She introduced herself, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Director of Veterans Affairs Special Programs." She gestured to her companions. "And this is Richard Harrison, CEO of Horizon Transport Solutions, and Dr. Patricia Morrison from City Memorial Hospital Board." George's face had gone from red to pale in seconds. I'm sorry, but this is a private company matter. We have protocols." "Yes, about those protocols." Richard Harrison interrupted smoothly, removing a folder from his briefcase. "We've been monitoring taxi services treatment of disabled veterans for some time now. Very interesting findings." He placed the folder on George's desk with deliberate care, particularly concerning Metro Express's recent pattern of driver terminations. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, her professional demeanor somehow making the cramped office feel like a hospital boardroom. "We've had multiple reports of your drivers refusing assistance to disabled patients, citing company policy. This has resulted in several dangerous situations at our facilities." Colonel Kennedy's eyes swept the room, settling finally on Ray. "Then tonight we witnessed firsthand how your policies forced a driver to choose between basic human decency and his livelihood. A driver, I might add, who was helping a decorated veteran who lost his leg in service to his country." The other dispatchers had begun to edge toward the door, sensing that this was no longer a simple termination meeting. George remained frozen behind his desk, his hand still on Ray's suspension notice. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where the power dynamics had suddenly and dramatically shifted. "I believe," Colonel Kennedy continued, "that we need to have a much broader discussion about Metro Express's operational policies and their impact on public service." She turned to Ray, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Wilson, would you mind waiting outside for a few minutes? We'd like to speak with your management team privately first." Ray nodded, still trying to process the sudden turn of events. As he stepped out into the morning air, he finally pulled Tom's business card from his pocket. In the clear light of dawn, he could read the gold-embossed text. Thomas Parker, Executive Director, Veterans Transportation Initiative, Office of Special Programs. Below it, handwritten in firm strokes, "Sometimes kindness has powerful friends." Outside the Metro Express office, Ray leaned against his taxi, watching the sun climb higher over the city skyline. The morning traffic had begun to pick up, horns honking in the distance as commuters started their day. His clothes were still damp from the rain, but he barely noticed. The events unfolding inside the office seemed surreal, like a dream he might wake from at any moment. Through the windows, he could see animated discussions taking place. Colonel Kennedy stood with military precision, occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point, while George Cooper seemed to shrink further into his chair with each passing minute. Richard Harrison was reviewing documents spread across the desk, while Dr. Morrison appeared to be making notes on a tablet. The scene reminded Ray of those nature documentaries where larger predators casually rearrange the established order of things. Other drivers began arriving for the morning shift, casting curious glances at the expensive SUVs parked outside and the continuing discussion visible through the windows. A few recognized Ray and approached cautiously like visitors at a funeral, unsure of what to say. Word of his suspension had already spread through the driver's messaging group. Bad news traveled fast in their tight-knit community. "Hey, Wilson," Mike Chang, a veteran driver of 15 years, called out softly. "Heard what happened. That was a stand-up thing you did." He paused, glancing at the office. "But those suits in there, what's going on?" Several other drivers gathered around, equally curious. Ray explained about Tom Parker and the unexpected arrival of Colonel Kennedy and her associates. The story spread quickly among the arriving drivers, their usual morning routines forgotten in favor of watching the drama unfold. Ray's phone buzzed, a text from Anna. "Dad, you're usually home by now. Everything okay?" His heart tightened. How could he explain everything that had happened? How could he tell her that he'd risked their future on a moment of compassion? But before he could respond, the office door opened. Colonel Kennedy emerged first, her face professionally neutral. Behind her, George Cooper looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Richard Harrison and Dr. Morrison followed, engaged in quiet conversation. The assembled drivers quickly tried to look busy, pretending they hadn't been watching the whole time. "Mr. Wilson," Colonel Kennedy called, "would you join us inside?" Her tone was gentler than before, but still carried that natural command presence that made it more of an order than a request. As Ray followed them back into the office, he noticed George Cooper gathering his personal items from his desk, supervised by what appeared to be a company executive he'd never seen before. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. The morning sun now filled the room, and the earlier tension had been replaced by something else, anticipation perhaps, or possibility. Richard Harrison took the lead this time, his manner friendly but businesslike. "Mr. Wilson, we've been having a very productive discussion about Metro Express's policies and their impact on community service," he began, settling into what had been George's chair. "It seems your actions last night have brought several ongoing issues to a head. Issues that we've been monitoring for some time." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, her tablet displaying what looked like statistical data. "We've documented numerous incidents where rigid company policies have created dangerous situations for patients, particularly those with disabilities. Your case highlighted exactly what we've been concerned about: compassionate people being punished for doing the right thing. Colonel Kennedy nodded in agreement. The Veterans Transportation Initiative was established precisely because of situations like this. We've been looking for partners who understand that service to the community and business success aren't mutually exclusive. She paused, sharing a look with Harrison. Which brings us to why we're here. Harrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. Metro Express is being acquired by Horizon Transport Solutions. Effective immediately. We're implementing a complete overhaul of policies and procedures with a focus on community service and ethical business practices. The Veterans Transportation Initiative will be a key partner in this transition. Ray's mind struggled to process the implications. The corporate takeover explained the unknown executive supervising George's departure. But what did this mean for his job? For the other drivers? For Anna's future? As if reading his thoughts, Harrison continued. We need people who understand both the practical and human aspects of this business, Mr. Wilson. People who have demonstrated both long-term commitment and strong ethical judgment. He pulled out a new contract document. We'd like to offer you a position as our new Community Services Director, overseeing the implementation of our revised policies and training programs. The salary figure on the contract made Ray's head spin. It was more than triple his current income with full benefits and a company car. College for Anna wouldn't be a dream anymore. It would be a certainty. But more than that, it was a chance to make sure no other driver would have to choose between compassion and survival. Additionally, Dr. Morrison added, we'd like to establish a scholarship program for the children of our employees, focusing on medical and healthcare education. We understand your daughter has aspirations in that direction? She smiled warmly. We believe investing in the next generation of caregivers is essential to our community service mission. Ray looked down at Tom's business card still in his hand. The morning sun caught the gold embossing, making it shine like a beacon. From being on the verge of losing everything, he now stood on the threshold of something he could barely comprehend. A chance not just to survive, but to help change the very system that had nearly crushed him. The transition at Metro Express happened faster than anyone expected. Within days, new signs appeared bearing the Horizon Transport Solutions logo, and a wave of changes swept through the company like a fresh breeze after a storm. Ray's first week as Community Services Director was a whirlwind of meetings, training sessions, and policy revisions. His old taxi now sat in the company's museum display, a symbol of the transformation taking place. The dispatch office had been completely renovated, the dark and cramped space replaced by an open, modern command center. Where George Cooper's desk once stood, a collaborative workspace now encouraged dialogue between dispatchers and drivers. The old rule books had been replaced by new guidelines that emphasized both professional service and human compassion. Ray's story had become part of the company's new training program, shared with each incoming class of drivers. Tom Parker became a regular visitor to the office, working closely with Ray to integrate veteran services into their transportation network. The decorated veteran who had seemed so vulnerable in the rain that night was revealed to be a highly influential figure in veterans' affairs, with connections throughout the city's power structure. His wheelchair now seemed less like a sign of weakness and more like a badge of honor, commanding respect wherever he went. You know, Tom mentioned one afternoon, watching new drivers practice wheelchair assistance techniques. I've been doing these accessibility checks for years. Most companies just see us as problems to be managed. That night in the rain, you saw me as a person first. That's what we're teaching here now. His words carried the weight of years of experience, both as a soldier and as an advocate for veteran rights. Colonel Kennedy's Veterans Transportation Initiative had become the cornerstone of Horizon's community service program. The partnership brought in specialized training from military transport experts, teaching drivers how to assist passengers with various disabilities. Ray's team developed new protocols that balanced safety and efficiency with human dignity. The program's success quickly gained attention from other cities looking to implement similar reforms. The scholarship program Dr. Morrison had mentioned became reality even sooner than expected. Anna's eyes had filled with tears when Ray showed her the acceptance letter from Harvard Medical School, along with the full scholarship package from the Horizon Wells Medical Education Fund. "Dad," she had whispered, hugging him tight. "Your kindness that night didn't just help one person, it's going to help so many people." Richard Harrison proved to be more than just a CEO interested in good publicity. He regularly joined driver training sessions, sharing his vision of a transportation company that served as a vital community resource. Under his leadership, Horizon's market share actually increased as customers responded to their ethical business practices and community-focused approach. The changes weren't limited to Metro Express. Other taxi companies in the city began revising their policies, realizing that compassionate service could be good for business. The story of the taxi driver who risked his job to help a veteran had spread, becoming something of an urban legend in the industry. Ray sometimes heard distorted versions of that night from drivers who had no idea they were talking to the actual person involved. 1 year to the day after that rainy night, Ray stood before a gathered crowd at the grand opening of the Horizon Community Transportation Center. The modern facility would serve as both a training center for drivers and a support hub for passengers with special needs. As he prepared to cut the ribbon, Ray caught sight of his reflection in the building's glass facade. The man in the businessman's suit still looked a bit surprised to be there, as if he hadn't quite gotten used to his new role. Transportation isn't just about moving people from point A to point B, Ray began his speech, looking out at the assembled faces. He saw Anna in the front row, wearing her new white medical student's coat with pride. Beside her sat his old taxi colleagues, now wearing the smart new Horizon uniforms. Tom Parker and Colonel Kennedy were there too, along with Richard Harrison and Dr. Morrison. It's about moving our community forward together. Every person we transport has a story, has dignity, has worth. The applause that followed felt like validation of everything they'd worked to achieve. But for Ray, the real reward came later that evening, as he watched a Horizon driver help an elderly woman with her groceries without hesitation, without checking any rule book. The driver caught Ray watching and simply nodded. No explanation needed, no fear of consequences. This was the new normal. Back in his office, Ray kept his old taxi medallion mounted on the wall alongside Tom's business card. Together, they told a story of how one moment of kindness had rippled outward, touching countless lives. His phone buzzed with a text from Anna. "Just finished my first anatomy class. Dad, I'm really going to be a doctor." Ray smiled, remembering the rain-soaked night that had seemed like an ending but had actually been a beginning. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. A young driver stood there, looking nervous. "Sir," she said, "I just had a situation. I went off route to help a passenger who was having trouble. I know it's not strictly protocol, but—" She trailed off, clearly expecting reprimand. Ray smiled, gesturing for her to come in. The lessons of that rainy night would continue to be passed forward, one act of kindness at a time. As Horizon Transport Solutions flourished under its new community-focused mission, Ray found himself increasingly drawn into the broader world of corporate social responsibility. Companies from across the country began reaching out, eager to learn how a simple taxi service had transformed into a model of ethical business practices. The story of that rainy night and its aftermath had taken on a life of its own, featured in business magazines and industry conferences. One particularly busy morning, Ray sat in his office reviewing the latest expansion plans. The Community Transportation Center had proven so successful that Horizon was opening similar facilities in 5 other major cities. Each center would incorporate the lessons learned from that first year, with dedicated veteran services and medical transport divisions. The wall of his office, once bare, except for his old medallion and Tom's business card, now displayed numerous awards and recognition for community service excellence. Anna called during her lunch break from medical school, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Dad, you won't believe what happened. Remember that story I wrote about you for my scholarship essay? My professor wants to use it as a case study in medical ethics, about how small acts of kindness can transform entire systems." Ray smiled, remembering how far they'd come from their days of counting pennies for her application fees. A knock on his door interrupted their conversation. Tom Parker wheeled himself in, followed by Colonel Kennedy and an unfamiliar man in an expensive suit. "Ray," Tom said, his eyes twinkling with that same knowing look from their first meeting. "There's someone you need to meet." The stranger stepped forward, introducing himself as Senator James Mitchell, chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. "Mr. Wilson," the senator began, settling into one of the visitor chairs, "your program has caught Washington's attention. We're drafting new legislation on accessible transportation services, and we'd like your input." He pulled out a thick folder of documents. "The Veterans Transportation Initiative has proven that ethical business practices and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. We want to make your standards the national model." Colonel Kennedy stepped forward, adding her perspective. "The military has been watching Horizon's success closely. We're considering implementing similar programs at bases nationwide. Veterans helping veterans. It's a natural fit." She shared a meaningful look with Tom. "But we need someone who understands both the practical and human elements to oversee the rollout." The implications of their presence began to sink in. This wasn't just about one taxi company anymore, or even one city. This was about changing the entire transportation landscape across the country. Ray thought about all the drivers like him, facing similar choices between compassion and survival. About all the passengers like Tom, whose dignity often hung in the balance of corporate policies. Richard Harrison joined them, having arrived quietly during the discussion. "Ray, remember when we talked about ripple effects?" He gestured to the senator. "This is bigger than we imagined. The Horizon model is proving that ethical business isn't just morally right. It's economically sustainable. Other industries are taking notice." The meeting continued for hours, delving into the details of potential national standards and implementation strategies. Ray found himself drawing on every lesson learned over the past year, from driver training protocols to community engagement initiatives. The senator's staff took copious notes, particularly interested in how Horizon had managed to improve both service quality and profitability. As the day wound down, Tom remained behind after the others had left. "You know, Ray," he said thoughtfully, "that night in the rain, I wasn't just testing company policies. We were looking for someone who understood that true leadership is about more than following rules. It's about setting the right examples." He wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the busy street below where Horizon vehicles now moved efficiently through the traffic, their new logo gleaming in the sunlight. "The senator's proposal could change everything," Tom continued. "Imagine every transportation company in the country operating on the principles we've established here. No more choosing between doing right and keeping your job. No more passengers left in the rain because of corporate policies." He turned back to Ray, his expression serious. "But it won't be easy. Change never is." Ray nodded, understanding the challenge ahead. The national program would face resistance from companies comfortable with their old ways of doing business. There would be arguments about costs, about liability, about efficiency. But they had proof now. Hard data showing that compassionate service could also be good business. A text message lit up Ray's phone. Anna again, sharing a photo from her hospital rotation. She was standing with an elderly patient, both smiling broadly. "Dad, just helped my first veteran patient," the message read. "Told him about you and Tom. He said real heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they drive taxis." The message brought Ray back to that rainy night, to the moment when he'd chosen to step out of his taxi despite knowing the consequences. He couldn't have imagined then how that one decision would ripple outward, touching so many lives. Now, standing in his office with Tom, looking at proposal that could transform transportation services nationwide, he understood that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Tom watched him reading the message, a knowing smile on his face. "Ready to change the world, Ray?" he asked quietly. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the Horizon logo on a passing vehicle, making it gleam like a beacon of hope. Ray touched his old taxi medallion on the wall, then turned to Tom with determination. The next chapter of their story was just beginning. The national rollout of the Transportation Accessibility Program began in stages, with Ray spending more time in Washington than he'd ever imagined possible. The Senate hearing room felt a world away from his old taxi, but his testimony about that rainy night and its aftermath resonated with lawmakers from both parties. The image of a taxi driver choosing compassion over job security struck a chord that transcended political divisions. Anna attended the first hearing, taking a rare day off from her medical residency to watch her father address Congress. Sitting in the gallery, she could hardly believe this confident speaker was the same man who had once worried about making ends meet. Ray's voice carried the weight of experience as he explained how ethical business practices had transformed not just one company, but an entire industry's approach to community service. The choice between profit and compassion is a false one, Ray testified, his words broadcast on national news. At Horizon, we've proven that treating people with dignity isn't just right, it's good business. Our revenue has tripled since implementing these policies, while customer satisfaction has reached record levels. The statistics backed him up. Horizon's model had been studied by business schools across the country, becoming a case study in successful corporate transformation. Senator Mitchell's transportation bill, now known as the Wilson-Parker Initiative, proposed nationwide standards for accessible transportation services. The name had been Tom's idea, though Ray still felt slightly embarrassed seeing his name on federal legislation. The bill included funding for training programs and infrastructure improvements, all based on the successful model developed at Horizon. Between congressional hearings, Ray found himself traveling across the country, speaking at conferences and consulting with transportation companies eager to adopt the Horizon model. Each city brought new challenges and opportunities, but the core message remained the same. Compassion and profitability could coexist. Tom often accompanied him, their unlikely partnership serving as living proof of their program's success. During one particularly memorable presentation in Chicago, Ray noticed an elderly woman in the audience who reminded him of that rainy night. After his speech, she approached him with tears in her eyes. "My son was a taxi driver," she said softly. "He was fired last year for helping a disabled passenger outside of policy. He hasn't found work since." Ray exchanged glances with Tom, who nodded subtly. By the end of the day, her son had been offered a position with Horizon's new Chicago division. The program's impact extended far beyond transportation. Other industries began examining their own policies, questioning whether rigid rules might be causing more harm than good. Healthcare companies, retail chains, and service industries started implementing similar community-focused initiatives. The ripple effect that Richard Harrison had predicted had become a wave of corporate social responsibility. Colonel Kennedy's military transport program had also exceeded expectations. Veterans across the country were finding new careers in transportation services, their military experience proving invaluable in handling complex logistics and emergency situations. The sight of veterans helping veterans had become common at airports and transit stations nationwide. Back in his hometown, Ray walked through the expanded Community Transportation Center, now 3 times its original size. The training facility had become a model for centers across the country, with state-of-the-art simulation equipment and comprehensive accessibility programs. New drivers learned not just the technical aspects of their job, but the human elements that made the Horizon model special. Anna's medical career had flourished alongside her father's success. Her research into transportation accessibility's impact on patient outcomes was gaining attention in medical journals. She often collaborated with Dr. Morrison, their work highlighting the crucial link between reliable transportation and healthcare access. The scholarship program they'd established had already helped dozens of students pursue medical careers. Tom's office at the Veterans Transportation Initiative had become a hub of innovation, constantly developing new ways to serve the community. His military background and personal experience with disability had proved invaluable in designing practical solutions to accessibility challenges. The program had expanded beyond transportation, now including housing assistance and job training for disabled veterans. One evening, as Ray prepared to leave his office, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 10 years ago, a small article about a taxi driver being fired for helping a disabled passenger. Tom had written a note across it. Sometimes the end of one road is the beginning of a better one. The clipping now hung beside his old medallion, a reminder of how far they'd come. Richard Harrison joined Ray for coffee the next morning, both men watching the sunrise over the city they'd helped transform. You know, Harrison mused, when we first acquired Metro Express, I thought we were just buying a taxi company. Instead, we ended up starting a movement. He gestured to the street below, where Horizon vehicles moved efficiently through traffic, each driver trained to see passengers as people first, fares second. A group of new trainees passed by, listening intently to their instructor, a veteran in a wheelchair, teaching them proper assistance techniques. Ray smiled, remembering his own first day of training, back when rules seemed more important than people. Now, compassion wasn't just permitted, it was policy. The change that had started with one choice in the rain had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Ray's phone buzzed with a message from Anna. "Dad, guess what? The hospital is implementing a free transport program for elderly patients based on your model." The news filled him with quiet pride. The ripples continued to spread, each act of kindness building on the last, creating a future where doing the right thing wasn't just an option, it was the standard. 5 years into the Wilson Parker Initiative, the transformation of America's transportation landscape was undeniable. The legislation that had started with one taxi driver's act of kindness had reshaped how the entire nation approached accessible transportation. Ray, now executive director of the National Transportation Accessibility Board, found himself looking back on that rainy night with a sense of wonder at how far things had come. The annual Transportation Ethics Conference in Washington, D.C., had become the industry's premier event, drawing participants from around the world. This year's keynote session featured a special celebration, the millionth veteran served under the program. The grand ballroom of the Capitol Hilton was packed with transportation executives, government officials, and community leaders, all gathered to mark this milestone. Anna, now a practicing physician specializing in accessibility healthcare, sat in the front row beside Tom Parker. Her research on transportation's role in healthcare outcomes had revolutionized how hospitals approached patient care. The scholarship program she'd helped establish had expanded to 15 cities, creating opportunities for hundreds of students from underprivileged backgrounds to pursue medical careers. Senator Mitchell took the podium first, his silver hair catching the spotlight. 5 years ago, he began, we passed legislation that many said was impossible. They said compassion and profit couldn't coexist in modern business. They said national standards for accessible transportation would bankrupt the industry. He paused, letting his words sink in. Today, we've proven them wrong on every count. Transportation company profits are up 40% nationwide, while customer satisfaction has reached historic highs. The statistics displayed behind him told a compelling story. Accident rates had plummeted. Employee retention had soared. Companies that had initially resisted the changes were now among their strongest advocates. The Horizon model had become the industry standard, studied in business schools, and praised in economic journals. Colonel Kennedy, her uniform now bearing a general's stars, presented the next segment. The Veterans Transportation Initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations, now operating in all 50 states. When we started this program, she explained, we hoped to help veterans access better transportation. What we created instead was a movement. Veterans helping veterans, building communities, changing lives. The screen behind her showed images from across the country. Veterans in wheelchairs becoming transportation coordinators, disabled soldiers training as dispatchers, former military personnel managing accessibility programs. The initiative had created over 50,000 jobs nationwide, with an emphasis on employing disabled veterans in meaningful roles. Dr. Morrison joined them on stage, her presentation focusing on the healthcare impact of accessible transportation. 5 years ago, missed medical appointments due to transportation issues cost our healthcare system billions annually, she noted. Today, those numbers have been cut in half. But the real success stories aren't in the statistics. They're in the lives changed, the dignity restored, the barriers broken down. Ray watched from backstage, still somewhat amazed at how their simple program had grown into a national movement. Richard Harrison stood beside him, both men quietly proud of what they'd helped create. "Remember when we thought we were just fixing one taxi company?" Harrison mused. "Sometimes the smallest changes have the biggest impacts." As Ray stepped up to deliver his keynote address, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd, George Cooper, his former dispatcher. After leaving Metro Express, George had struggled to find work until the Veterans Transportation Initiative offered him a chance at redemption. Now he managed one of their most successful training programs, teaching dispatchers how to balance efficiency with compassion. 5 years ago, Ray began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "I made a choice in the rain. It wasn't a heroic choice. It wasn't even a difficult choice. It was simply the right thing to do." He glanced at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. "What we've built since then isn't about rules or regulations. It's about remembering that behind every policy, every procedure, every business decision, there are real people with real needs." The presentation screen behind him showed images from the program's history: the first community transportation center, the inaugural training class, the congressional hearings, the national rollout. But mixed with these milestone moments were smaller ones: drivers helping elderly passengers with groceries, veterans assisting other veterans, dispatchers going above and beyond to ensure passenger safety. "The real success of this program," Ray continued, "isn't in the numbers, though they're impressive. It's not in the legislation, though it's important. It's in the culture we've created. A culture where compassion isn't just permitted, it's expected. Where doing the right thing isn't a risk, it's a requirement." As he spoke, an aide handed him a note. Ray smiled as he read it, looking up to find Anna in the audience. "I've just been informed that my daughter's hospital has completely eliminated transportation-related missed appointments through their implementation of our program. But more importantly, they've restored dignity to their patients' healthcare journey." The applause that followed wasn't just for Ray's speech. It was for every driver who'd chosen kindness over convenience, every dispatcher who'd put people before policies, every veteran who'd found new purpose in serving others. It was for the transformation of an industry and the validation of a simple truth: that compassion and success could go hand in hand. After the ceremony, Ray found Tom waiting by the stage. "Not bad for a taxi driver and a veteran in the rain," Tom said with a smile. Ray touched the old medallion he still carried in his pocket, a reminder of where it all began. Outside, the streets of Washington were filled with accessible transportation vehicles bearing the marks of their program's success. Each one represented not just a service, but a commitment to the principle that had started it all: that sometimes the right choice is simply being human. The Wilson Parker Initiative had become more than just a transportation program. It had evolved into a blueprint for ethical business practices across multiple industries. 10 years after that rainy night, Ray found himself addressing an international conference on corporate social responsibility in London. The audience included CEOs, government officials, and business leaders from around the world, all eager to learn how a simple act of kindness had sparked a global movement. The conference center's main hall was packed with representatives from 30 countries, each seeking to implement similar programs in their own nations. Screens displayed real-time translations in multiple languages as Ray shared the journey from taxi driver to international policy advisor. Anna, now head of accessibility medicine at a major teaching hospital, sat in the front row with her own delegation of healthcare innovators. "The principles we developed aren't unique to transportation," Ray explained, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. "They're universal truths about human dignity and corporate responsibility." Behind him, Slides showed the program's expansion into retail, healthcare, hospitality, and other service industries. When we prioritize compassion alongside profit, everyone benefits: employees, customers, shareholders, and communities. Tom Parker, though retired from active management, had flown in specially for this event. His wheelchair now sported the latest accessibility technology, developed through partnerships spawned by their initiative. What began as a solution for veteran transportation has become a model for inclusive business practices worldwide, he added during the panel discussion. We're seeing companies transform their entire approach to customer service and employee relations. The statistics were compelling. Companies that had adopted the Wilson-Parker model showed average profit increases of 45% over 5 years, while employee turnover dropped by 60%. Customer satisfaction scores consistently exceeded industry standards, and legal liability claims had plummeted. The business case for compassion had become impossible to ignore. Richard Harrison, now chairman of a global transportation consortium, presented data from their latest international expansion. We've implemented these principles in 15 countries so far, he reported. From Tokyo to Toronto, from Sydney to Stockholm, we're seeing the same results. When you empower people to do the right thing, both humanity and business thrive. During the afternoon breakout session, Ray led a workshop on implementing ethical business practices. Corporate leaders shared their own stories of transformation, each echoing the lesson learned that rainy night. Rigid rules without human judgment often cost more than they save. A Japanese CEO described how adopting the program had revolutionized their approach to customer service. A Brazilian transportation executive shared how their version of the initiative had improved life in Rio's favelas. Colonel Kennedy, now retired but still actively involved in veterans programs, moderated a panel on global accessibility standards. The principles we developed in the U.S. are universal, she emphasized. Whether you're in London or Lagos, people deserve to be treated with dignity. The Veterans Transportation Initiative had become a model for similar programs in NATO countries, creating employment opportunities for disabled veterans worldwide. Dr. Morrison's healthcare accessibility study had expanded to include data from 12 countries, demonstrating the crucial link between transportation access and public health outcomes. When we remove transportation barriers, she explained, we see immediate improvements in community health metrics. It's not just about getting people to appointments, it's about maintaining their dignity and independence. The conference's innovation showcase featured new technologies developed through the initiative: advanced wheelchair lifts, AI-powered dispatch systems that prioritized accessibility needs, and training simulators that helped drivers better understand passengers with disabilities. Each innovation had grown from the simple premise that caring for people was good business. During the evening reception, Ray found himself speaking with a young entrepreneur from India who was developing a rickshaw service based on their model. "Your story inspired me," the young man explained. "In my country, many disabled people struggle with transportation. I want to change that." Similar conversations happened throughout the evening, each representing another ripple in the expanding wave of change. Anna joined them, sharing exciting news from her hospital's latest research. "Dad, remember how we started with just trying to help people get to medical appointments? Now we're seeing systematic changes in how healthcare systems approach accessibility worldwide." Her work combining medical care with transportation access had become a model for hospitals globally. A surprise video presentation featured testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the program. Among them was George Cooper, Ray's former dispatcher, who had gone on to establish training programs for compassionate dispatch management. "I was wrong," he admitted on screen. "Rules without humanity aren't rules worth having." His transformation from rigid enforcer to advocate for change symbolized the broader shift in corporate culture. As the conference drew to a close, Tom wheeled up to Ray's table. "You know what I'm most proud of?" he asked quietly. "It's not the numbers or the awards or even the global expansion. It's that somewhere tonight, someone like you is choosing to help someone like me, and they're not afraid of losing their job for doing it." Ray nodded, understanding completely. The old taxi medallion in his pocket had become something of a talisman, reminding him of where it all began. Outside the conference center, London's streets were filled with accessible vehicles bearing the hallmarks of their program, visible signs of how far their idea had spread. The next morning's international papers would carry stories about the conference and its impact on global business practices. But for Ray, success wasn't measured in headlines or statistics. It was measured in the small acts of kindness happening every day, in cities around the world, as people chose compassion over convenience, humanity over rules, and dignity over expedience. As the sun set over central London, Ray's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Richard Harrison. "Turn on BBC News now." In his hotel room, Ray flicked on the television to find a breaking story that would add yet another dimension to their decade-long journey. A massive hurricane had devastated parts of Southeast Asia, and the Wilson Parker Initiative was being called upon to coordinate an unprecedented international transportation relief effort. Within hours, the conference center had transformed into an emergency command post. Representatives from 20 countries huddled around tables, coordinating their response. The principles they'd developed for everyday transportation were about to be tested on a massive scale. Tom Parker, despite his retirement, was back in his element, his military experience proving invaluable in crisis management. "This is what we've been preparing for without knowing it," Tom announced to the assembled team. "Every procedure, every protocol, every lesson we've learned about coordinating accessible transportation is needed right now." The screens behind him showed the extent of the disaster: flooded cities, displaced populations, and a critical need for coordinated transportation services. Colonel Kennedy had already activated the Veterans Transportation Initiative's emergency response protocols. Trained veterans from 6 countries were mobilizing, their experience with the program's accessibility standards making them uniquely qualified for disaster relief. "Our veterans understand both logistics and human needs," she explained during the emergency briefing. "They know how to move people efficiently while maintaining their dignity." Oana's medical expertise became crucial as they coordinated with hospitals in the affected region. "We're not just moving people," she reminded the planning team. "We're moving patients, elderly residents, people with disabilities. Every transport decision has medical implications." Her years of research into transportation's impact on healthcare now informed their evacuation strategies. "When we remove the barriers between doing what's right and doing what's profitable, we unlock human potential in ways we never imagined." Tom Parker, seated in the diplomatic section, watched with quiet pride. Though his hair had turned completely white and his military medals had multiplied, he still carried himself with the same dignity that had impressed Ray that rainy night. The Veterans Transportation Initiative he'd helped create now operated in 47 countries, each program adapted to local needs while maintaining their core principles. Colonel Kennedy, recently appointed as UN Special Envoy for Accessible Transportation, presented the statistical impact of their work. "In the past 5 years alone, our programs have helped over 10 million people access essential services," she reported. "But more importantly, we've created a model where compassion and efficiency work together, where human dignity drives innovation." Anna's medical research had expanded into a global study of transportation's role in public health. Her team had documented how accessible transportation networks improved everything from maternal health rates to chronic disease management. "When we ensure people can reach medical care with dignity," she explained during the specialized healthcare session, "we transform not just individual lives, but entire communities." Richard Harrison shared how the business model had evolved beyond their wildest expectations. Companies that had adopted the Wilson Parker principles showed sustained growth across all metrics: customer satisfaction, employee retention, profit margins, and community impact. "We've proven that ethical business practices aren't just morally right, they're economically superior," he declared to the assembled diplomats. During the afternoon session, Dr. Morrison presented their latest innovation, a global healthcare transportation network that connected hospitals, relief organizations, and local transport services. The Southeast Asian crisis showed us what's possible when we coordinate our resources, she explained. Now we're making that level of cooperation standard practice worldwide. The UN presentation included video testimonials from around the world, a disabled veteran in Kenya running a successful transportation company, a former taxi dispatcher in Brazil coordinating emergency medical transport, a wheelchair-bound entrepreneur in India revolutionizing rural accessibility. Each story traced its roots back to that rainy night in Chicago when one driver chose compassion over rules. George Cooper, now heading the International Dispatch Training Academy, demonstrated how their principles had transformed emergency response protocols. We teach dispatchers to think like human beings first and operators second, he explained. The result is faster response times, better resource allocation, and most importantly, more lives saved. Between sessions, Ray found himself in conversation with world leaders who saw the initiative as a model for other social challenges. If we can transform transportation, one African president noted, we can transform education, healthcare, housing, any system where human dignity should come first. The day's events culminated in the announcement of the Global Transportation Accessibility Fund, a multi-billion-dollar commitment from participating nations to expand the initiative's reach. Tom wheeled onto the stage for the signing ceremony, his presence a powerful reminder of how personal challenges could inspire universal solutions. 15 years ago, Tom addressed the assembly. A taxi driver made a choice in the rain. He didn't know I was testing company policies. He didn't know we were looking for someone to lead a transformation. He just knew that helping another human being was more important than following rules. The silence in the Great Hall was profound as he continued. Today, that choice has created a movement that crosses borders, transcends politics, and proves that compassion is the most powerful force for change. Anna joined her father at the podium for the closing remarks, their presence together symbolizing the generational impact of the initiative. My father taught me that small acts of kindness can change the world, she said. What we've built together proves that when we align our policies with our humanity, there's no limit to what we can achieve. As the day drew to a close, Ray found himself standing at the UN building's vast windows, looking out over New York City. Below, he could see vehicles bearing the initiative's symbol moving through the streets, each one representing a commitment to putting people first. The old taxi medallion in his pocket seemed to carry extra weight today, a reminder of how far they'd come and how many lives they'd touched. Tom joined him at the window, both men reflecting on their incredible journey. You know what amazes me most? Tom mused. Somewhere right now, someone is making the same choice you made that night. They're choosing kindness over rules, humanity over policy. And because of what we've built, they're being celebrated for it, not punished. Ray nodded, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The UN presentation had been another milestone in their journey, but the real success was in the countless small acts of compassion happening every day around the world. They had created more than a program or an initiative. They had helped build a world where doing the right thing was simply the way things were done. 20 years had passed since that rainy night in Chicago, and Ray Wilson found himself walking through the Smithsonian's newest exhibit, Transportation and Social Change, the Wilson Parker Legacy. The museum had dedicated an entire wing to documenting how one act of kindness had sparked a global transformation. His old taxi stood at the center of the display, restored to its original condition, a symbol of how far they'd come. Anna, now a leading figure in global healthcare policy, walked beside him, reading the exhibit descriptions with a mix of pride and amazement. Her own contributions to medical transportation access were featured prominently, showing how the initiative had revolutionized healthcare delivery worldwide. The walls displayed interactive screens, showing real-time data from transportation networks across the globe, all operating on principles that had started with one simple choice: "Dad, look at this," Anna called, pointing to a holographic display showing the ripple effects of their program. The visualization traced how their ideas had spread from one taxi company to transportation systems worldwide, then into other industries, and finally into international policy. The effect was mesmerizing. Countless lines of influence spreading outward like waves in a pond. Tom Parker's wheelchair was also on display, preserved exactly as it had been that rainy night. Though Tom had passed away the previous year, his legacy lived on through the millions of lives touched by their initiative. A video loop played nearby, showing his last public speech at the United Nations. "Kindness isn't just a virtue," he had said. "It's the most practical solution to our greatest challenges." Colonel Kennedy, now retired but still actively involved in veterans programs, joined them at the exhibition. Her military uniform, displayed alongside Tom's wheelchair, bore witness to the crucial role veterans had played in their success. 20 years, she mused, and we're still finding new ways to apply what we learned from that night. Richard Harrison guided a group of business students through the economic impact section, explaining how the Wilson Parker principles had revolutionized corporate thinking. "The old debate between profit and ethics is over," he told them, pointing to 2 decades of data. "Companies that embrace these principles consistently outperform those that don't." The museum had recreated the old Metro Express dispatch office, complete with George Cooper's desk. The former dispatcher, who had become one of their strongest advocates, had contributed his personal memories to the exhibition. His journey from rigid rule enforcer to compassionate leadership trainer exemplified the transformation they'd sparked in corporate culture. Dr. Morrison's research occupied an entire section, documenting how improved transportation access had transformed global health outcomes. Interactive displays showed before and after statistics from communities worldwide, reduced mortality rates, improved chronic disease management, better maternal health outcomes. "Transportation isn't just about moving people," her recorded voice explained. "It's about connecting them to better lives." In the center of the exhibit, a wall of screens showed real-time images from around the world, accessible vehicles helping people in every corner of the globe, veterans finding new purpose through transportation services, communities being transformed by improved access. Each image represented countless lives touched by the ripples of that rainy night. A special display honored the everyday heroes, drivers, dispatchers, and coordinators who had embraced the Wilson Parker principles. Their stories played on continuous loop. A driver in Mumbai who had started a program for disabled children, a dispatcher in Rio who had revolutionized emergency response protocols, a veteran in Kenya who had created a transportation network for rural healthcare. The exhibition's technology section showcased how their principles had driven innovation, advanced accessibility features, AI-powered dispatch systems that prioritized human needs, virtual reality training programs that taught empathy alongside technical skills. Each innovation had grown from the simple premise that compassion and efficiency could work together. Ray paused at a recreation of the moment he had stepped out of his taxi to help Tom. The scene was depicted in striking detail: the rain, the wheelchair, the choice that had changed everything. Beside it, a simple plaque read, "Sometimes the smallest choices have the largest impacts." The words brought back every detail of that night with startling clarity. Anna squeezed his hand, understanding the emotion of the moment. "You know, Dad," she said softly, "when I was writing college essays about heroes, I never imagined you'd end up in the Smithsonian." They both laughed, but there were tears in their eyes. The museum had captured something profound, not just their story, but the universal truth about how compassion could transform the world. A group of school children crowded around the old taxi, their teacher explaining how one person's choice could change history. Ray watched them, remembering Anna at their age, dreaming of medical school. Now she was changing healthcare systems worldwide, her own daughter following in her footsteps at Harvard Medical School. As they reached the exhibition's end, they found themselves in a room filled with messages from people whose lives had been touched by the initiative. The walls glowed with thousands of testimonials from around the world, each one a testament to the power of choosing kindness over rules, humanity over policy. The final display showed a simple question: what will your choice be? Ray stood there, surrounded by 2 decades of impact, yet still humbled by how far a single act of compassion could reach. The old taxi medallion in his pocket remained a constant reminder of where it all began: a rainy night, a difficult choice, and the courage to choose kindness over consequence. The ripples of that choice continued to spread, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. The day after the Smithsonian exhibition opening, Ray received an urgent call from the Global Transportation Initiative's headquarters in Geneva. A new challenge had emerged that would test everything they'd built over the past 20 years. Climate change had triggered unprecedented migration patterns worldwide, and their accessible transportation network was being called upon to help coordinate the largest humanitarian response in history. Anna flew in from Boston, where she'd been presenting at a medical conference, to join the emergency planning session. The Situation Room buzzed with activity as experts from around the world connected virtually, their faces filling the wall of screens. The scope of what they faced was staggering. Millions of people needing relocation, many elderly or disabled, all requiring dignified transportation solutions. "This is what we've been preparing for without knowing it," Ray addressed the assembled team, echoing Tom's words from years ago. "Everything we've learned about accessible transportation, every system we've put in place, every principle we've developed, it's all led to this moment." The maps behind him showed the affected regions, spanning multiple continents and crossing countless borders. Colonel Kennedy's successor at the Veterans Transportation Initiative, General Maria Rodriguez, presented their initial response plan. "We have veterans teams ready to deploy in 30 countries," she reported. "These aren't just drivers. They're trained coordinators who understand both logistics and human dignity." The veterans network they'd built had become a crucial component of global crisis response. Richard Harrison had already begun mobilizing corporate resources. "Every company that adopted the Wilson Parker principles is joining the effort," he announced. "We're looking at the largest coordinated transportation response in history." The business network they'd created was proving invaluable, turning profit-driven corporations into humanitarian response units without missing a beat. Dr. Morrison's healthcare transportation protocols were being adapted for mass migration scenarios. "We're not just moving people," she reminded them. "We're moving families, communities, carrying their hopes and dignity with them." Her team had developed specialized systems for tracking medical needs across long-distance relocations, ensuring continuous care during transit. The Smithsonian exhibition had inadvertently become a command center, its technological displays repurposed to coordinate the global response. The old taxi stood witness as its legacy evolved yet again, inspiring a new generation of problem solvers. Ray couldn't help but appreciate the symbolism, the past and future of compassionate transportation meeting in one place. Anna's medical expertise proved crucial as they developed protocols for handling health concerns during mass movement. "We're applying everything we've learned about accessible medical transportation," she explained, "just on a scale we never imagined." George Cooper's International Dispatch Training Program became the backbone of their coordination efforts. "Every dispatcher we've trained understands that flexibility and compassion save lives," he reminded his global team. "Now we're putting that understanding to the ultimate test." The dispatch centers they'd established worldwide became crucial hubs for coordinating the massive operation. As the response plan took shape, Ray found himself thinking about Tom Parker. "He would have seen this coming," Ray mused to Anna during a quiet moment. "He always said we weren't just building a transportation system, we were building a safety net for humanity." The principles they'd developed together were now being tested on a scale neither could have imagined. The global media covered their efforts extensively, amazed by how quickly their network had adapted to the crisis. "The Wilson Parker Initiative has evolved from a corporate responsibility program into humanity's mobility insurance policy," one journalist observed. The coverage showed their vehicles moving through diverse terrains, each one representing lives being protected and dignity being preserved. Messages poured in from operators worldwide, sharing stories of kindness and courage as drivers went above and beyond to help families in transit. A driver in Greece had turned his vehicle into a mobile classroom for children during long relocations. A dispatcher in Mexico had created an impromptu family reunification system. A veteran coordinator in Kenya had developed new routes that helped preserve community ties during relocation. The Smithsonian's Everyday Heroes wall gained new stories daily, documenting how their principles were being applied in increasingly challenging situations. Each story reflected the original spirit of that rainy night, choosing compassion over convenience, humanity over expediency. Ray stood before the exhibition's central display, where his old taxi still symbolized the power of simple choices. The vehicle's doors now opened to reveal a holographic presentation of their current crisis response, linking past and present in a powerful demonstration of how far they'd come. 20 years ago, he told a group of young volunteers, we learned that kindness isn't just the right choice, it's the most practical solution to our biggest challenges. Anna joined him, adding her perspective. What started with helping one person in the rain has become a global network for preserving human dignity during humanity's greatest challenges. She pointed to the real-time displays showing their vehicles moving across continents. Every one of those vehicles represents not just transportation, but hope, dignity, and the promise that no one gets left behind. As they coordinated the massive operation, Ray touched the old taxi medallion he still carried. Its familiar weight reminded him that the biggest changes often start with the smallest choices. The crisis they faced was unprecedented, but their response was built on a simple truth he'd learned 2 decades ago. When you choose kindness, you never know how far the ripples will spread. As the global migration crisis entered its 2nd month, the Wilson Parker Initiative's response had evolved into something unprecedented. The Smithsonian Command Center operated around the clock, coordinating efforts across continents. Ray found himself working alongside Anna, watching as their principles of compassionate transportation were tested and proven on an epic scale. The holographic displays showed their vehicles moving across 5 continents, each one representing dozens of lives in transit. But it wasn't just about movement. It was about maintaining dignity during displacement. They had transformed cargo holds into mobile community centers, installed educational programs in long-haul vehicles, and created systems for keeping families connected during relocation. "Dad, look at this," Anna called, pointing to incoming data from their Mediterranean fleet. "The healthcare protocols we developed for local medical transport are working perfectly at scale." The screen showed how their vehicles were doubling as mobile medical units, ensuring continuous care during long journeys. What had started with helping people reach doctor's appointments had grown into a comprehensive system for protecting health during mass migration. Richard Harrison arrived with news from the corporate sector. "Every company that adopted our model is exceeding expectations," he reported. "They're not just providing transportation, they're innovating solutions we never imagined." One company had developed mobile hydroponic gardens in their larger vehicles, ensuring fresh food during long transits. Another had created a system for maintaining cultural practices during relocation. Colonel Kennedy's successor, General Rodriguez, brought updates from the Veterans Network. "Our teams are doing more than driving," she explained. "They're becoming community builders." Veterans who had found purpose through their program were now helping others rebuild their lives in transit. Their understanding of displacement and resilience made them perfect guides for communities in transition. Dr. Morrison's Medical Coordination Center had expanded to handle the increased demands. "We're not losing a single patient's medical history during transit," she announced proudly. "Every health condition, every medication schedule, every special need is being tracked and met." The system they'd built for local medical transportation had scaled beautifully to handle international movement. George Cooper's dispatch training proved invaluable as they coordinated across time zones and cultures. Every dispatcher understands that they're not just moving vehicles, they're moving lives, he reminded his global team. The compassionate dispatch protocols they developed were helping manage the largest coordinated movement of people in history. The Smithsonian exhibition had become a symbol of hope, its displays now showing real-time updates of their crisis response, alongside the history of their movement. School groups still came through, learning not just about past achievements, but witnessing current history in the making. Ray often took breaks from coordination to speak with them, sharing how small acts of kindness could grow into global movements. Anna's daughter, Sarah, now a second-year medical student, had joined the effort, bringing fresh perspective to their healthcare protocols. "Mom, Grandpa," she said during one planning session, "we're not just handling a crisis, we're creating a new model for human mobility." Her generation saw possibilities that went beyond the original vision, incorporating emerging technologies and social innovations. The international media had started calling it the Great Dignity Movement, focusing not just on the scale of their operation, but on how they maintained human dignity during mass displacement. Stories emerged daily of how their protocols made a difference. A driver in Turkey who helped a displaced musician save his instrument, a dispatcher in Greece who reunited separated families, a veteran coordinator in Jordan who created mobile libraries. Ray found himself thinking about Tom Parker more and more as the crisis response grew. He would have loved seeing how the principles we developed are helping preserve human dignity on this scale, he told Anna during a quiet moment. The wheelchair that had started their journey now stood as a testament to how addressing one person's needs could lead to solutions for millions. The old taxi in the exhibition seemed to glow with new significance as visitors connected its story to the current crisis. From helping one person in the rain to helping millions across continents, one observer noted. But the core principle remains the same, choosing compassion over convenience. Richard Harrison brought news of another development. Countries were beginning to incorporate Wilson Parker principles into their national infrastructure planning. "What we created as a crisis response is becoming a new standard for human mobility," he explained. "They're seeing that compassionate transportation isn't just morally right, it's essential for human resilience." The global response network they built continued to evolve, incorporating new technologies and approaches while maintaining their core principles. AI systems helped coordinate movements while preserving human dignity. Blockchain technology ensured secure tracking of medical records and family connections. Solar-powered vehicles reduced environmental impact during long transits. As Ray watched the holographic displays tracking their vehicles across the globe, he remembered that rainy night 20 years ago. The choice that had seemed so simple then, helping someone in need, had grown into a movement that was reshaping how humanity handled its greatest challenges. The old taxi medallion in his pocket remained a constant reminder that the biggest changes often start with the smallest choices. Anna joined him at the displays, both of them watching as their vehicles moved across continents, each one carrying not just passengers but hope. "You know, Dad," she said softly, "when you stepped out of your taxi that night, you weren't just helping one person. You were showing the world what's possible when we choose kindness over rules, humanity over expediency." The crisis they faced was far from over, but their response had proven that the principles they'd developed could scale to meet any challenge. The Wilson Parker Initiative had become more than a transportation program. It had become a testament to humanity's capacity for compassion and a blueprint for preserving dignity in an increasingly mobile world. 25 years had passed since that rainy Chicago night, and the Wilson Parker Initiative had achieved something remarkable. As Ray stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated Global Transportation and Humanitarian Center in Geneva, he marveled at how a simple act of kindness had grown into an international movement that had fundamentally reshaped human mobility and crisis response. The center itself was a testament to their evolution, a gleaming complex of buildings that housed everything from dispatch training facilities to research laboratories, from crisis response command centers to medical coordination units. The original taxi and Tom's wheelchair had been given places of honor in the main lobby, symbols of their humble beginnings and profound impact. Anna, now a global leader in humanitarian medicine, sat in the front row alongside her daughter Sarah, who had just completed her medical residency. 3 generations of their family, had now contributed to the movement, each adding new dimensions to their understanding of compassionate service. The audience included representatives from every major transportation and humanitarian organization worldwide, gathered to mark a historic transition. 25 years ago, Ray began, his voice carrying through the vast auditorium. I made a choice in the rain that cost me my job but gave us all something far more valuable, a new way of thinking about human dignity and corporate responsibility. The screens behind him showed images from their journey: the old Metro Express office, the first community transportation center, the Smithsonian exhibition, and their recent global crisis response. Richard Harrison presented the latest data on their impact. Over 100 million people served, operations in 175 countries, and a revolutionary approach to humanitarian logistics that had transformed how the world handled crises. What started as a taxi company's policy change has become the global standard for ethical business practices, he noted. We've proven that compassion and profitability aren't just compatible. They're inseparable. Dr. Morrison's final research paper, presented at the ceremony, documented how their transportation network had revolutionized global healthcare access. We've eliminated transportation as a barrier to medical care in every community we serve, she announced proudly. The principles we developed for helping one person reach a doctor's appointment now ensure millions can access life-saving care. General Rodriguez shared how the Veterans Transportation Initiative had evolved into the world's largest humanitarian service organization. Our veterans have found purpose in serving others, she explained. They've transformed their own challenges into solutions that help millions. The screens showed their teams in action across the globe, from disaster response to community building. George Cooper's dispatch training program had become the global standard for humanitarian logistics coordination. We've trained over 1 million dispatchers worldwide, he reported. Each one understands that behind every journey is a human story, deserving of dignity and respect. His protocols had been adapted by organizations ranging from emergency services to space exploration agencies. The ceremony included a special tribute to Tom Parker, whose vision had helped shape their movement. Tom understood that true change comes from aligning policy with humanity, Ray remembered. He saw potential where others saw problems, opportunity where others saw obstacles. The veterans in attendance stood in silent tribute to their fallen comrade and champion. Sarah, representing the next generation of their movement, presented their vision for the future. We're not just moving people, she declared. We're connecting humanity, preserving dignity, and building resilience for whatever challenges tomorrow brings. Her presentation showcased new technologies and approaches that would carry their principles forward. AI-enhanced compassion training, quantum-coordinated logistics, and biotechnology-assisted accessibility solutions. Anna shared how their healthcare protocols had evolved into a comprehensive model for human welfare during mobility. Every vehicle in our network is now a potential lifeline, she explained. Every driver a potential caregiver, every dispatcher a potential lifesaver. Their approach had reduced healthcare disparities in every region they served. The ceremony marked Ray's transition from active leadership to advisory role, but it was hardly a retirement. The principles he'd helped establish had become self-sustaining, evolving and adapting to meet new challenges. The Wilson Parker Initiative had grown beyond any individual's control, becoming a movement powered by millions of daily acts of compassion. As Ray concluded his speech, he held up his old taxi medallion. The Smithsonian exhibition had grown into a living museum of compassion, its displays updated in real time to show how the Wilson Parker principles were being applied across Earth and beyond. Ray's old taxi remained at its center, a humble reminder that the greatest changes often start with the smallest choices. In his final public address, Ray shared the lesson that had guided their movement from the beginning. Compassion isn't just a feeling, it's a practical solution to our greatest challenges. When we choose to see each other's humanity, when we choose to act with kindness, we create possibilities that never existed before. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Ray. It was for every driver who had stopped to help someone in need, every dispatcher who had chosen flexibility over rigid rules, every veteran who had found new purpose in serving others. It was for the movement that had grown from a single act of kindness into a global force for change. As Ray stepped down from the podium for the last time, he was surrounded by 3 generations of his family, each carrying forward the legacy in their own way. Anna's medical innovations, Sarah's technological advances, and a new generation of Wilson children already showing the same commitment to compassion that had started it all. The old taxi medallion, now preserved in a special display alongside ETC West Victoria Bacon and Nuwak about a spoiler city tidan than a symbol. It had become a reminder that the smallest choices could have the largest impacts. The raindrops that had fallen that night in Chicago had created ripples that would continue to spread, touching lives across Earth and beyond. Tom Parker's vision of a world where kindness and efficiency worked together had become reality. The Veterans Transportation Initiative he had helped create had become a model for how humanity could face its challenges with both compassion and competence. His legacy lived on in every veteran who found new purpose through service to others. The final chapter of the Wilson Parker Initiative wasn't about endings. It was about beginnings. Each day brought new opportunities to apply their principles in new ways, to extend the reach of compassion further, to prove again that kindness was the most practical solution to humanity's challenges. Ray's journey from taxi driver to global humanitarian leader had shown that anyone could change the world through simple acts of kindness. His story had become a beacon of hope, inspiring others to choose compassion over convenience, humanity over rules, dignity over expedience. As the sun set on the Global Transportation and Humanitarian Center, its golden light reflecting off the building's sleek surfaces, Ray stood with his family, watching the next generation prepare to carry their mission forward. The ripples from that rainy night would continue to spread, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined, proving that when we choose kindness, we choose a better future for all. The story of the Wilson Parker Initiative wasn't just about transportation or business or healthcare. It was about the power of human compassion to transform the world. It was a reminder that in every moment we have the choice to act with kindness, and in those choices lie the seeds of global change. And somewhere, in every city across the world, someone was making the same choice Ray had made that rainy night, choosing to help, choosing to care, choosing to see the humanity in others. The ripples continued to spread and would continue spreading far into humanity's future among the stars. The memory of his wife's final days in the hospital flashed through his mind, the kindness of strangers who had made their burden a little lighter. "Sir, my daughter once asked me what makes someone a hero," he said finally. "I told her it's not about doing extraordinary things. It's about doing ordinary things when they're hard. When my wife was sick, strangers helped us countless times. Small kindnesses that meant everything. I guess I just try to pass that on." Tom was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His military medals glinted faintly, catching the reflection of distant streetlights. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "Take this," he said, holding it out. "You might need it soon." The card was heavy, made of expensive paper, but in the darkness, Ray couldn't make out what was printed on it. The gold embossing caught the light, hinting at something official and important. As Ray helped Tom into his wheelchair, he noticed movement near the SUVs. Figures stood watching in the rain, their presence somehow deliberate. A woman in a military uniform and 2 men in expensive suits observed the scene with intense interest. Tom seemed unsurprised by their attention, nodding slightly in their direction before turning back to Ray. "Remember, son, kindness has a way of coming back around. Keep that card safe." His words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to their brief encounter. The drive back to the Metro Express office felt like heading to his own execution. The card Tom had given him sat heavy in his pocket, but Ray hadn't had the chance to read it yet. The rain had finally begun to ease, but the streets remained deserted, giving him too much time to think about what awaited him. Each passing streetlight seemed to count down the minutes to his confrontation with George. George Cooper's face appeared in Ray's mind. The dispatcher's perpetual scowl and rigid adherence to rules had made him infamous among the drivers. In the past year alone, he had terminated 8 drivers for policy violations, each dismissal adding to the fear that kept the remaining drivers in line. Ray's perfect record had made him somewhat untouchable until now, but he knew that wouldn't count for much once George filed his report. The dispatcher took particular pride in maintaining what he called operational discipline, treating each policy violation as a personal affront. The office building loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. Ray could see George's silhouette waiting by the entrance, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Several other dispatchers had gathered as well, likely summoned to witness another example being made. As he parked his taxi for what might be the last time, Ray touched the card in his pocket, wondering what help a veteran from a shelter could possibly offer against the machinery of corporate policy. Taking a deep breath, Ray stepped out into the drizzling rain. The weight of his decision, the uncertainty of his future, and the responsibility to his daughter all pressed down on him as he walked toward the building. Yet somehow, he felt a strange peace. Whatever came next, he knew he'd made the right choice. The first rays of dawn were beginning to break through the clouds, casting a subtle glow over the city as Ray prepared to face the consequences of his compassion. The Metro Express office was unusually crowded for this hour. Through the glass doors, Ray could see several dispatchers huddled around George Cooper's desk, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting. As Ray pushed through the entrance, the conversation stopped abruptly. The silence felt orchestrated, like a carefully planned execution of someone's career. George stood behind his desk, his face flushed with what looked like hours of pent-up anger. The incident report lay prominently on his desk, already filled out in his precise handwriting. Next to it was Ray's file, 10 years of perfect service about to be erased by a single act of compassion. The rain outside had subsided to a gentle patter, but inside the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Wilson," George's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Do you know how many policies you violated tonight?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Abandoning your vehicle, unauthorized passenger assistance, ignoring direct dispatcher commands. 3 major violations in 1 incident." He picked up the incident report, brandishing it like a weapon. "In your 10 years here, you've never had a single violation. What made you think you could just throw away the rule book tonight?" Ray stood quietly, water still dripping from his jacket onto the linoleum floor. The other dispatchers watched with a mix of sympathy and relief that they weren't in his position. Through the windows, he could see the first hints of dawn painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.